And for joining. Everyone, I'm excited to be here for the first of ANHD's 12th Annual Community Development Conference events. This is our 12th year doing these conferences, but I will talk about how this is our second year doing this kind of conference. So my name is Barika Williams. I'm the Executive Director of ANHD, the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. So glad to have everybody here. For some of you, I may not have gotten to see or meet a lot of you, especially those virtual. I joined as ANHD's Executive Director in January 2020. Got to work with this amazing team remotely for about 2.5, 3 years, but we're all really thrilled to get to be back in person now for our second time and second round doing this conference post-COVID. So this year we're continuing our reformatted and reimagined conference. So what we did was in COVID, we did what everyone else did. We went virtually, but it also gave us a moment to kind of think about how we should be shifting a lot of our programs and our work. And the same way that in COVID, a lot of us sort of left downtowns and central business districts and we're in our neighborhoods, we kind of said, this actually makes a lot more sense for us as ANHD. And so we switched our conference format and left the sort of big hotel, midtown focused, event-based, and broke up our conference into multi-day events over the course of a couple of weeks, and that are centered specifically in our communities, in our neighborhoods, with our members as partners, hosting the events, highlighting their work, highlighting some of the things that they're seeing in their neighborhoods and across our pressing issues. So this year we will be in Flatbush, Brooklyn, Harlem, Kingsbridge, Mazpath, Ridgewood, and I know I'm missing a couple. So as you can see, we're sort of hopping around New York City and really getting out of our offices and homes, wherever you work from these days, and into community events and spaces. So for those of you who are here in New York City, whether you're online today or in the room, we hope that you are able to join us for one of the 6 more events that are to come after this one that span from, next one is tomorrow, all the way until concluding event is October 26th, the finale event at City Tech in downtown Brooklyn. So I want to pause and thank the ANHD staff who are here, but in general who have done an amazing job of pulling this off. We do pretty much all of these events with us as a team, Loose Productions, Lucy Leiden, who really supports our work in this, and with our members as our partners. So again, this is not like we don't sort of export this out. We figure out what these conversations are and what the discussions that need to be had are with our members ourselves. I want to thank the ANHD board who supports us and has stood with us in sort of switching this format. It means a lot more events and a lot more things that we're hopping around to, but I think they really love the intent that we're trying to put behind this. And a huge thank you to, of course, all of our sponsors. So to our movement leader sponsor, Citibank, to our community convener sponsor, New York Community Bank, to our neighborhood defender sponsors, both Wells Fargo and Goldman Sachs, and to our lead law sponsor, Goldstein Hall. So thank you to all of them. There's a number of sponsors that go into this that make this whole thing possible. And I want to thank Chase for having us here in their space today and for supporting this work. So a lot of what you're going to hear about, we talked to the Chase team and they were like, we love the idea of this. We want to be a part of this. We want to support you all doing this work. And so we are able to really work on this initiative and have this type of conversation because of the work and investment that Chase is making. So I'm going to pause now and bring up Marco Villegas. I got it right, from Chase to give a few remarks about the investments that they're making.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. We're really happy to be hosting this event. I'm the program officer for neighborhood development here in New York City, really focused on wealth creation around affordability and housing. So really excited about here. I mean, I'm excited about the work that ANHD has been doing, just evaluating some of the strengths and weaknesses of the tools that are used for community development. Specifically, I personally, I grew up here in Queens, was away for about 10 years, and the dynamics of just living in New York City have changed a lot in those 10 years. And equally, there's a need to just shift and evolve how community development is done and approached. So looking forward to the conversation, and I'll hand it over to Emily, who will be moderating the event. Or back to Marika.
Thank you, Marco. All right, so I'm just going to cue up a little bit of like what the conversation is, and then, as Marco said, I'm going to pass it off to Emily Goldstein, ANHD's Director of Organizing and Advocacy. She's going to moderate this amazing discussion and introduce our panelists. So for those who don't know, ANHD will turn 50 years old next year. We've been around and we've been doing this for quite some time. I also think we have a very unique origin story in the sense of we didn't sort of decide to create ourselves. There isn't like a person who was like, I want to create this nonprofit for me. There were 7 community-based organizations, including some that you'll hear from, like Northwest Bronx Community Clergy, who said, we're doing this work in our neighborhoods and we feel like there should be something that connects us across. And so those folks founded and created ANHD. They saw the need for something to weave these different community development corporations and neighborhood-based organizations and community organizing groups focused on housing and affordability together. And so that's where ANHD comes from. And so in COVID and in a lot of transition, but also this is where we've gotten great conversations with the board and board support, as like we are all growing as organizations, realizing we've got a lot of new people and a lot of new faces and a lot of new voices coming into community development work. For those who are online, some of the folks that we have in the room with us are ANHD's Center for Community Leadership Fellows and our Morgan Stanley Community Development Fellows. So these are our next generation of who's going to be doing this work here in New York City and sometimes nationally. I have run into a fellow alum at a grocery store in Atlanta, Georgia. Go figure, right? It happens. So I think we realize like part of what we kind of need to invest in as a part of this work is understanding and helping make sure all of us understand what is this thing that we're a part of? What is this community development movement? And I say movement intentionally because here in ANHD, we deeply, deeply believe in movement building and where are we headed? So you're going to hear some of the conversations from some folks who have been a part of New York's community development space for a long time in a different sets of roles. But this connects to a larger initiative that we're working on with the support from Chase to interview a lot of our longstanding community development stakeholders and leaders to ask folks like, what did you feel like we got right over the past 50 years that we've been doing this in New York City? Where are our gaps? How do we need to think about doing this differently, right? Because the reality is we should and could be doing community development differently than how we have done it for the past 50 years. It can't look like exactly the same thing. It may have similar central tenets, may have similar values, may be rooted in similar principles, but some of what we address is going to have to be different because a lot of our neighborhoods are very different, right? Like Bed-Stuy 50 years ago and Bed-Stuy today are very different places. Astoria 50 years ago and Astoria today are very different places. The conversation that was happening in the South Bronx 50 years ago, 40 years ago versus what South Bronx and Northwest Bronx are talking about is very different, right? And so I think what we're really trying to equip all of us to have is a conversation about where we're headed. And that also has to be grounded in what we've done and where we've come from and what we've accomplished. So this is a part of a bigger project. I do want to recognize 2 folks who are working with us. Designing for Democracy. The team, for those who have seen it, Undesign the Red Line is a really amazing exhibit, is also working with us to kind of capture the totality of these histories, and partners as well to do some of the digital and visual capturing of what this has looked like over time. And so that's a little preview. Stay tuned. Hope everybody engages when they get that email that says, come check out what this is. We're still searching for a name for it. So anybody's got name ideas, we would love one. But with that, I think it's exciting to sort of kick off our conference event with the conversation on community development. Like, what is it? What have we done? Where have we come, and where are we headed? So with that, thank you, everybody. And I'm going to turn it over to Emily Goldstein.
Okay, sorry. Thank you all, and welcome again. My name is Emily Goldstein. I'm the Director of Organizing and Advocacy with ANHD. I'm really excited to get to moderate today's discussion. I've been involved in the community development movement for a while. I am also a huge history nerd, and so I'm like really, really into this project. And I'm really thrilled to get to bring up several panelists who have been in the community development movement significantly longer than me, and who have sort of their own perspectives and their own stories on where our movement has been, how we've evolved, and where we might be heading next. So I will briefly introduce them and then ask them to come up and they can tell you more about their own work. I'll be joined by Bernell Grier, who is the Executive Director of IMPACCT Brooklyn. Bernell provides leadership for this comprehensive community development and housing organization, whose mission is to create and preserve income-targeted housing while also promoting business development and resident leadership throughout Brooklyn with a focus on Central Brooklyn. I'll also be joined by Margaret Groarke. Margaret is a lifelong Bronx resident who worked for the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition in the 1980s and has been involved with the organization ever since. She also teaches political science at Manhattan College. And last but definitely not least, Lydia Tom, who spent many years as senior advisor and prior to that, New York Deputy Director at Enterprise Community Partners, helping to finance and preserve affordable housing in New York and then nationally. She was also involved in the founding of Asian Americans for Equality, or AAFE, and is currently their board president. So I'll ask the panelists to join me up here, and we can all have our seats and turn on our mics. Conversation. Everybody turn on your mic.
Got it.
Cool.
All right, I think.
So again, thank you all so much for being here. And I want to start, we can go in any order, we can just go down the line by asking you, if you want to share a little bit more about your work in the community development movement, and answer an opening question of how you actually personally define community development.
Where do you want us to begin?
Margaret, why don't you go first?
I was hoping you wouldn't say that. And maybe I'm the bad person to start because I don't use the term community development a lot. Like, I think about myself as having been involved in community organizing over the last 35 years or so. And of course, that's led to a lot of community development. And I think one of my perspectives on community development is that many of the organizations that exist that we kind of think of as like long, well-established, good organizations that are doing great community development work came out of really hard scrabble organizing efforts early on. Like I look at, from my Northwest Bronx involvement, we created a lot of housing companies, Ford and Bedford Housing, Mount Hope Housing, Build, which no longer exists. And like all of those came out of, people struggling to make housing better, and there being some housing that needed somebody decent to manage it. And so it's like, let's create something, so that's half an answer to your question.
That's great. Lydia, what do you think?
So I will say that
AAFE is turning 50 next year as well. And we started out as a grassroots civil rights organization trying to fight for a community that had been invisible, didn't have a voice. And my parents were immigrants and there was no one to advocate for them and for their rights. And it was at a time when other communities were starting to stand up for themselves. And I think that's the origins of Asian Americans for Equality, is really looking at this big building being built with public dollars in Chinatown and not a single person of color from our community on the work site. And we didn't know how to go about trying to demand jobs, but we reached out to other communities that had done that in Harlem and in Bed-Stuy and other places. So they actually walked the lines with us. And that was the origins of our organization. We got into other things through organizing. And I think what we found was that after we got some jobs on the construction site, we realized that there were other issues in our community as well. There was Peter Yu, who was an engineer, who was brutalized by the police. And for the first time, 20,000 people in the community came out and protested. That had never happened in Chinatown before. And then a few years later, a lot of tenements started, there were fires started in tenements, and there were 2 people who died and 125 people became homeless overnight, no place to go. And so we said, we had to do something. And so that's how we got started in housing, not because we intended to be developers or said, let's figure out how to do this. We got into it because we felt we needed to be builders as well as advocates for the community. And I think a lot of groups around that time got into development, not because that was their intent, but from the organizing side of it.
Yeah. I'm going to add to that. I think the common theme for all of us is really the community organizing. So for IMPACCT Brooklyn, which is legally known as Pratt Area Community Council, we were actually created 60 years ago. And it was during a time in the Fort Greene, Clinton Hill area that there was white flight. You know, there were a lot of things happening in the 60s and folks were running away from New York City and out of Brooklyn. And so there was a lot of abandonment, and the people that were left there came together and said, let's save this community. And I think we did too good a job. But also too, for myself, I grew up in Harlem and I grew up in public housing. And my first summer youth employment job was to work at it was actually at a neighborhood board. They called it Neighborhood Board Number 1, and it was on McCombs Place. And when I was there, I learned that the buildings that had been abandoned, the landlords had abandoned the buildings, and there was no heat, no hot water. And so my job, as my very first job, was to go around as a tenant engagement person and being able to put flyers throughout the building and to be able to say, this is how you get heat and hot water. And so for me, it's ever since really childhood, my teenage years, to say, you know, look, the community has to be engaged, involved. And from that, you know, when you look at definition of community development, it really is about the community coming together and being civically engaged. And I will say that right now we've almost become, you hear about sort of the community development or the nonprofit industrial complex and what have you, but over time, things have changed because we've convinced a lot of corporations to support us, but then also to get the money, to get the support, we have to act in a certain way. So understanding it's really still very much about the civic engagement and all of us knowing what to do and fighting for the rights.
Thank you all. And because I'm an organizer, I'm going to stick with this theme of sort of the relationship between, can't let it go, the relationship between organizing and community development for a minute. You know, you all touched on it, and it's something I've thought a lot about. You know, my sense is that the relationship was different when many of the organizations that you all have worked for or with were founded versus now. There are many community development corporations that do organizing as well as development, but sometimes, like Bernell, you touched on, sometimes there's a little tension in that. There are other organizations in our ANHD's membership and in our network where it's sort of divided off. So there's the organizing group and the housing development group, right? Separate nonprofits, and they may collaborate, but they've really sort of defined themselves separately. I guess for any of you, what do you think is a sort of productive way to make use of both and to bring together and sort of use the strengths of both the organizing parts of our organizations and our movement as they are now, and the more housing development oriented parts. Like, how do we bridge that tension?
Yeah, it's funny when you say that, the tension, and for IMPACT, we are somewhat schizophrenic because we own properties. And then we also community organize and teach tenants how to fight. And so during the pandemic, there was a time that, folks were like, let's not pay the rent, free rent, we just can't do it. But also as owners, we know that we have to pay to be able to keep the elevators working, to pay the porters and supers. And they expect to have salary increases every year, just like everybody else. So how do we have the building budget and being able to balance both? And so, during that time, there ended up being, the Emergency Rental Relief Program. But that was something where the two sides sort of sat and talked and said, government, can you pitch in and be able to have rental assistance? But also when that rent is paid, it helps to support the landlords to keep the buildings operating. So when we think about things that end up being a win-win, that's, when community organizing and it comes together. I could probably go on and on because I used to work for Neighborhood Housing Services of New York City. It was a NeighborWorks organization. And NeighborWorks, at the time, there was a woman in Pittsburgh, Dorothy Richardson, who had come. She looked at the blight in her neighborhood and she said, something has to change. But she got corporations and government to come together, and for the three to then be able to create Neighborhood Reinvestment Corporation. So it took probably 10 years before Neighborhood Reinvestment Corporation, which is now NeighborWorks, to be finalized. But it really was that stick-to-itiveness and keeping it going of the residents to fight for the rights.
I would add that I'm stepping back and looking at when a lot of the nonprofits started in the city, and when the city had hundreds of thousands of vacant, partially occupied buildings. And thankfully, the city agreed to invest millions and millions of dollars and really empowered community groups to really be the owners, developers, and eventually the managers of this housing. And I think the design of that was great because it allowed community groups that were on the ground to become stewards of this housing long-term. Now, some of them might have been better than others, and some really continue to be great. But I think it was a step to say the community will lead this effort, and the community will learn and be trained, and we will invest in them. And I know at Enterprise, we did a lot of hand-holding, training, technical assistance, and got them through the whole entire process so that the buildings were finished on time, they got their compliance in place, and they also worked with their residents. And now, a number of these own hundreds and thousands of units because of programs like that. I think today, a lot of those groups are much more challenged. And I think part of the success of it was that they got institutionalized and remain stewards of this important asset. But also there's challenges to being institutionalized and running these buildings. And I think as organizers and advocates, in addition to being institution builders, you have to balance between the two. And I know that even at AAFE, when we were going through COVID, same thing. We had to have people who were on the organizing and service side working with the housing managers to really work with the residents, people who weren't paying rent, figure out what they can access if they were eligible for stuff. But you needed to ultimately say to them and have them understand that you do need the money to run the building. And I think a lot of groups are still struggling today in order to get back to where they were pre-COVID. And I think the understanding of the need to run these buildings, what it takes, needs to be an education process with not only the tenants, but all the staff, as well as the industry at large, because I think a lot of the groups may go under. They cannot subsidize these projects if there isn't enough cash flow to keep these buildings running. And it's not because they're poor managers or poor leaders of these organizations. And so I think there needs to be an investment. I think government needs to continue to support a lot of this inventory and the groups that are behind them. Otherwise, we will lose it. And I think what the result will be way worse than where we are today.
Yeah, you know, and the Northwest Bronx Coalition celebrates 50 years next year as well. You know, before my time, people made the decision. What we did in the Northwest Bronx was that when we set up, you know, housing companies or a credit union or whatever, those other kinds of institutions, we did them separately. And I think it was with the idea that a sort of different personality as an organization, like we thought it was valuable to create that institutionalization. And if you think about like the difference between what people were doing in the 70s and what we're doing now, you know, people didn't have an infrastructure on which to build. People were being very creative. Like we talk a lot now about fighting back and fighting forward. They were doing a lot of fighting back, but they were also fighting forward. They were creating things. They were creating community land trusts. They were creating not-for-profit housing companies. They were like trying to invent structures that would allow them to address the neighborhood problems. Some of those things worked and some didn't work, but people were trying to do things. And like the people, you know, who were at the Northwest Bronx before me, I think thought like that those were going to be two different kinds of organizations and maybe they needed each their own, you know, space. And so we did it separately. Some of them worked and some of them didn't work. So like, you know, it's the same struggles. But I think there was a fear that it would compromise the organizing, that it would like lead people to not want to take on certain fights, perhaps. You know, there's always struggles around it. The other thing is like, how do you make sure that those institutions we create continue to be responsive to the community? Some organizations have done a great job of that. Others we might think are like not so great at that. But like you really, you know, we're talking a lot about, we're creating a land trust in the Northwest Bronx now. And, you know, I think it's really important to look back at all the organizations that have been created over time and think about what worked and what didn't work. And how do we make sure that if we create a land trust, it's going to be accountable to the people who live in the Northwest Bronx 10 and 20 and 30 years from now.
Yeah. So I want to pick up on that theme of sort of creativity, and it's come up in different ways so far, you know, especially around the time that all three of your organizations and the whole community development movement were just sort of like coming into being. There was a lot that was kind of being invented, a lot of trial and error, right? Like it's not like there was my sense is there wasn't a roadmap to follow, right? Y'all were making it up as you went. Can you talk a little bit about maybe like a particular example of a creative solution that sort of came out of just needing to deal with conditions in the neighborhood you were working in?
So there's quite a few things in terms of just looking at over the past 50 plus years. You know, again, I don't know how it altogether got started, but I think because of the need to build affordable housing, which I call income targeted housing, you know, things like the low income housing tax credit. You know, if we didn't have that and have a way to be able to have equity, overall, again, in terms of tax credits being available for folks, for investors to come in and to be able to help us build, because as nonprofit organizations, we're not sitting with a lot of capital to do this work. So, to get all of this done, it takes money and it takes, government intervention. What can government do? Give tax credits. What do corporations need? Whether it, back in the day, whether it was Verizon or whoever else that was buying the tax credits, or utilizing them to be able to make these buildings happen. And so that was one of the innovations that happened in the last 50 years. We also have, the creation of the Community Reinvestment Act. And that was, again, a lot of the effort of the community overall. It was really looking at, the redlining that had taken place. How do you get how do you make that stop? It was very much supposed to be not just low, moderate income families. It was supposed to be also about looking at people of color, looking at racial discrimination. That didn't get written into the bill, But, because CRA is colorblind, but that was just something else that happened. And, we were talking earlier about, I used to also be a banker. I was a banker for 30 years. And with the Northwest Bronx Clergy Coalition, I just remember back in the day being called to a community meeting, and there was a CRA scorecard, and the whole group, it would be, hundreds of people in the audience, just saying, are you doing this? Are you promoting homeownership? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? And every bank had a scorecard, and it was a push. And I will say too, back then with the CRA, the banks really were concerned because they could not make a merger or an acquisition, without having, they wanted to have an outstanding, rating. So how do you get that? So you pour, again, additional support, equity, service investment into the community. And that helped to make a big difference over the past 50 years, having CRA in place.
So I'll just give a real example on the tax credit. So when we did our first project, we went to the city and got 2 buildings for $1. And we tapped every single city-state resource. We said, okay, we got all our finances together. We got to figure this out. And all of a sudden, it was a fire, a 3-alarm fire. And we lost some walls. And so all of a sudden, we have a whole now budget of $700,000. So how are we going to make this up? We tapped everything that we could already. And then I read about this new local housing tax credit. I said, what the heck is this thing? And I remember writing to Enterprise and saying, can you help us explain what this is? And they weren't really having a presence in New York at the time. I remember Jim Rouse coming to New York, and I think the thing that I would pick up in addition to that was public-private partnership being so important, because I think he understood and saw opportunity because he was a developer of public spaces and things like that. And I remember we would go up and look, and we would try to show how great a location we have. We're so close to downtown, but we're part of the community. And he would look at the opportunity, and we had a Fannie Mae person saying they were worried about distressed housing. And all they could see was the distress. But Gerard said, oh, here's all these opportunities. You got to do more. And I think you really need people to believe, but also you need a vehicle for that to happen. And I know that it was a guinea pig at that time. We were probably one of the first, not the first project in New York City that worked on it. And people kept scrutinizing us and saying, can you really make this happen? But that was a single investor at the time. You would have someone come in and do it. But I think it gave a resource that didn't exist before. And I think it really led to a process where the city said, let's maximize the credits. And they would tap all their subsidy dollars to make the difference. And it created a production program in New York that groups across the city could then tap into this financing to redevelop all the housing that was in their neighborhood. And I think that really spun off a lot of groups to really have a solid infrastructure from developer fees. But I would say in the community, I remember us doing research in New York City's Chinatown. We researched how much money was being deposited and saved by our community and how small the fraction was on the reinvestment. Here we are putting millions and millions of dollars, and very little of it came back. So while you advocated for that, we said, we have to actually build our own institutions. So we ended up setting up a community financial institution for small business lending and one around home ownership, because they said, unless we start to do that, no one else, the banks aren't really going to invest in this stuff unless we step up and help do it. And it's training in that. So I think you need to do both the advocacy to get them to the table, but at the same time, you can't count on them to do it. You have to, there were credit unions that were created at that time too. And I think you need to kind of look at other vehicles.
Right. Yeah, I just love the creativity of these stories. And I think there's a couple of lessons that we can get from that. One is that the things that we sort of take for granted now, like CRA and okay, this bank's applying for a merger, so we're going to write a letter. We're going to try to make sure that they clean up their act about whatever. CRA came out of people organizing. Northwest Bronx is part of an organization that's now called People's Action. Used to be called National People's Action. And we did hits on banks and congressional committees in DC demanding that they do something about the fact that you could look at a community and say, as you just said, we're investing this much, we're depositing this much, we're borrowing this much, we're depositing this much in this bank. and you're not putting any of that money back in our community. You're not investing, you're not making loans in our community. And it was that people noticed that, right? There's a great film that used to be up on YouTube and has disappeared. It's a little story from People's Action of the beginnings of the CRA work. And people were noticing that if their kids tried to get a loan to buy a house in the neighborhood they had grown up in, the bank would turn them down. And that was the thing that got people in Chicago to start organizing for like, this can't be okay, that the bank takes my money. I have my checking account there for years, or my savings account there. And when I go to get a mortgage, they don't want to talk to me. And that was like the root of the CRA organizing. And then you listen to like the creative things that people did to use it. We have to like use those tools, and we have to think of new ones, right? Like you can see like the work going on in your head that like you were trying to figure out at that time, what are we going to do? What are we going to put together to make this building work? And we have to use not only the like existing tools, but to be on the alert for what's the thing that we could create, either an institution or maybe there's a new law that needs to happen that we should be fighting for now. It's not, you know, it's not all done and cut and dried.
Yeah.
So
building on that, a lot of the tools that we're continuing to use came out of the 70s and 80s. The low-income housing tax credit is probably used in every housing development project currently, you know, that any nonprofit or, you know, even a lot of for-profits are doing. We rely heavily on the CRA. The city no longer has a lot of buildings to sell for $1, right? You know, we sort of have all these tools that were the creative solutions to problems of sort of really disinvestment, abandonment, right? And needing to be able to sort of reclaim and rebuild a lot of neighborhoods. I think the way a lot of our neighborhoods look now, the problems have often shifted towards, it's not that there isn't investment, it's that there's too much speculative investment, right? Or it's not that we can't build housing, it's that we can't build housing for folks who make less than $30,000 a year, which is the bulk of who actually needs it in New York City. Do any of you have, I mean, I'm asking for the silver bullet here, right? But what is that next set of tools that we should be starting to envision for the problems in our communities today? And maybe, you know, maybe there's lessons to be learned from the past, but maybe there's new tools that are needed.
I still believe in the private-public partnership to have the three engage, but it also means that in some instances, we've got to sort of adjust our capitalistic mindset. And so when you look at, you know, an investor might have to have a certain level of return on equity. When it's for the good of the community, can that return be a little less? You know, and then after there can be more equity put into a deal. You know, I also have another hat where I'm the vice chair of something called the Joint Ownership Entity, the JOE. And with the JOE, a lot of the organizations that are the nonprofit developers, you know, whether it's ourselves, St. Nick Alliance, Bridge Street, Local Development Corporation, and others have come together. And we're like, how do we keep properties affordable and, you know, and income targeted? And what we have been attempting to do is to bring properties all together under one entity and being able to create a strong financial position, a strong balance sheet, so that when it's time for a year 15 exit and that has to be refinanced, we're able to come together and under this joint ownership, be able to restructure a project and have it for the long term. So, you know, that's something that was created within the last, I want to say it was thought about 10 years ago. I think we signed on all the documentation probably about 6 years ago, but we have been up and operating the JOE, and now it has about, I think it has over, you know, 2,500 units within the JOE, and being able to move that forward. So it's like still thinking about ways that we can do this, but the JOE also won't work if the city of New York and the state of New York don't support us, and if corporations, you know, aren't still involved. So it still is that three-prong, four-pronged, because it also takes, as community development corporations, I think we still see the community as being our owner. So really telling us and being engaged with us on what to do.
I would say, I think we need to fine tune some of the instruments that we have been using for so long. I think the original intent and the purpose has been a little bit shifted when we adopted extended use for low-income housing tax credits and meant that minimally 30 years of affordability. But then you have people saying, oh, if you're 15 to exit, we want to be seeing some return. Well, you were never supposed to get additional return other than what you invested in it, and you got your credits. And now to say you're looking for additional benefit, that really was not the intent of the program. And also there was a 15% set aside for nonprofits. I think that has really not genuinely been adhered to. And I know that in some states, some nonprofits are in the mix. They don't even have controlling interest in those. And so you really need to adhere to what was originally intended, let alone increase the percentage that goes to the nonprofits, because then they're not in the driver's seat anymore. They're not able to make the decisions. And some of the groups have told me that they don't even know what the terms of the exit are because they're not at the table. And so some of the purpose and intent has kind of been distorted. So I think definitely the intent needs to be adhered to. And if anything, it needs to be improved, because we saw with COVID, you really need services and support for the residents in the buildings. And very often there's very few dollars, unless you're a supportive housing project, that is built into the project to fund that. And then you have separate reserves for that. I think we need to really say, let's underwrite it like we underwrite utilities and anything else, that there's support for residents that are in the project underwritten above the line, not below the line. And I think there are a lot of improvements that can be made. Now, the reality is there's more need than ever, both with the housing, but also competition with the credits. So we need to create a 2.0 for affordable housing finance. I think we can't just keep using the same thing, because obviously it's worked. There's a lot of bipartisan support for it, but it needs to be grown to really meet the need that's out there, because we have so many more people who have more need, and the gap is just getting worse. So even with all these millions of units that have been built, it hasn't addressed the solution. And the market's not going to take care of itself. It's not. It's just not going to do it unless we do something extra. So I think there definitely needs to be something more that can be done, but we need to kind of reinvent, but also revalue what was originally in the intent of the work that was put together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good point.
I mean, and Lydia and Bernell have a lot of expertise in this particular thing. I'm not going to try to weigh in on that. But like two things I was going to say about that is, I think one thing we're thinking about at the coalition lately is, as hard as we've worked on affordable housing and decent housing over the 50 years, we have the same problem. If anything, it's worse. Like the mismatch between what people can afford and what's available. And you were sort of hinting at this. And we've been thinking a lot about, like, community development we have to shift at least part of our focus to creating the kind of economic development in our communities that actually benefits the people in the community. We're very focused in the Northwest Bronx on the Kingsbridge Armory right now as our big development opportunity. And, if that's a beautiful building in which some great thing is happening 5 years from now, that doesn't mean good union jobs for people who live within a mile of that place, and doesn't mean like other economic benefits for people in that local community, it'll be a failure, however like lovely it is, and however, we really, there's just a lot of people in our community who need a more stable, solid income, health insurance. And that's what economic development in our communities has to be about now. And, I'm a lifelong Bronx resident. I'm a, upper middle class college professor, but I have to say, even completely selfishly, it makes my life better, right? If the people in my community have a more stable income. And I know all those people whose lives will be better if, they can easily afford their rent and they can, make choices about sending their kid to summer camp or like whatever, like little additional things that make life, good. And that's, it's challenging because that's something that we've done less of. And so we have less expertise or infrastructure in how to do that well. But it's like, I think really important. And the one like housing thing, and this is probably going to sound naive to the experts here on housing development, but it like frustrates me a lot. And I worked a lot to try to reshape the Jerome Avenue rezoning in the Bronx, with no success. But it frustrates me a lot that we offer like benefits to developers to develop fairly high income housing, right? Housing for people who make $130,000 a year. I don't know that we need to give anybody a gift to build that housing. I would love to see New York City target its available tax credits and subsidies and whatever a little bit further down the income scale so that we could do more like and I know that's a complex thing.
No, it's real. It's very real in terms of how do you build this? How do you put together the capital stack to be able to make sure that all of these things get paid for? And when it's a higher income person moving in, the rental is higher and the building cash flows better.
Yeah.
So, and then also the way things have been written, it's where there's options, when you look at, the 421A that was in place, and seeing that there's option A, B, and C. And so you can do something at 70% of area median income, or you could do something at 120% of area median income. What are you going to do if you have those options? So understanding, and that sort of gets back to another piece in terms of everything, whatever we look to change, we need to make sure that as citizens, that we look at it through a economic mobility, a racial equity lens, and question when things are being put in place, because there's always unintended consequences. And being able to, or intended consequences even, but being able to make sure that we speak up and speak out about when things aren't right or it's not going to really benefit the community. Right now, Atlantic Avenue, and you might have been reading about that, is, in the process of being redeveloped. The zoning's going to change. There's a lot of things that are going on there. For the past, under, our city council person, Crystal Hudson, has put together, these meetings and have used money to be able to have studies being done and wanting to have people come out, but that's the other part, is how do you get the community re-engaged to be out and to have voice and to be the ones that really need it the most, because the people that do show up are why we've got all kinds of transportation changes in New York City, in terms of speaking up. So it also defines who are we talking about when we say community.
So you took me where I wanted to go anywhere. I think we have time for one more question, then we're going to have some audience questions. I'm getting a nod from the back. So Bernell, you talked specifically about racial equity, and that's obviously threaded through, the stories you all have told already. Lydia, you were talking about sort of like the Chinatown community's response to seeing that none of the workers were like from the community or seemed to be of Asian descent, right? I know that Northwest Bronx has a long history of fighting redlining and sort of addressing other issues of racial inequity and discrimination. I guess the question I want to ask is how, in earlier phases of your work and of the community development movement, how did you sort of see the connections between the racial justice and the community development movements? And has that sort of changed or evolved over the years from your perspective? Lydia, do you want to go first this time?
Sure. So AAFE was born out of beliefs and value of social justice and working together. We wouldn't have been able to do what we did without that support, but also supporting each other, but also learning from each other. And I know a lot of the community groups who were active in the early years of housing development in New York City, they were in communities of predominantly communities of color. Those are the areas where that were disinvested in and were taken for back taxes, insurance, and things like that. I think particularly with the development of racial reckoning, I think there was an acknowledgement and that coincided with COVID as well, that we really needed to uplift leaders of color and communities of color. And we need to prioritize that, not just for the immediate that time that we see now, but as a way we do our work in community development. The affordable housing industry has grown a lot, matured a lot, and now it's really become big corporate business in it. It drives a lot of the agenda. A lot of the community folks that were the engineers of it in the beginning aren't really in the driver's seat anymore. And so I think we need to really think about how we center more of the work in the community from the people who really are the stewards of these communities. And your comment about working people, well, the credit doesn't support if you're above 60% of area median income, you're working poor, you're not in that mix. So we need to really look at how do we change some of these things so we can really foster more of an inclusive community and not just have the very rich and the very poor in these communities that people have been priced out of. And it's a shame because they lived through an area where no one wanted to live there. And all of a sudden, when it's getting better, they can't afford it anymore. So how do we kind of craft tools that really allow them to have the choice to stay? They don't have to stay, but they would have a choice to stay if they really wanted to. So I think we need to change some of these things. I know one thing they talked about was, so there's a credit for rental housing, but there isn't for homeownership. So maybe we need to be thinking seriously that we need to look at that. Zoning is another area. So one of the first things AAFE thought about, we actually had a lawsuit against Mayor Koch, right, the Special Manhattan Bridge District, because they created this zoning district that would allow higher density. But we said there needs to be some inclusion of affordable housing if you're going to give them that. And if the city and the state are seriously going to do zoning changes, we need to demand that there had to be some inclusion of affordable, decent, real affordable housing, not some small percentage of 10%, something substantial that really will address the needs of that community. And what it looks like in Northwest Bronx may be different from the Lower East Side, different from Bed-Stuy or Crown Heights, but it has to reflect the community that it's in and really be able to do that. And I think more of the communities need to figure out how they can get more into the driver's seat at the table when these things get discussed and negotiated. And that kind of gets us back to our original roots. How do we make these communities be the places that we want them to be, that we imagine them to be, so that they can really strive to get there?
Anyone else want to weigh in, or should we turn to the audience?
I mean, I guess I really want to like second what you said there about, you know, when we rezone areas of the city, as we rezoned Jerome Avenue in the Bronx, we're giving those property owners a big gift. And we missed our opportunity there to like demand more from them. We demanded a tiny percentage of affordable housing, but, you know, affordable housing, meaning perhaps housing for people who make 60 or 80 or 100% of median, who's not the people who live in Community Board 5 and need housing. So like, I really think that, like, I hope in the future rezonings, there's a little bit more conversation about that. I think it's too bad that we've set such a precedent of so many areas that have already been rezoned with, like, you know, a paltry commitment. And I guess I wanted to say about the racial justice thing, like my, like the Northwest Bronx story, really, like, you know, we were like largely neighborhoods of white ethnics going through racial change, Black and Puerto Rican people moving into the neighborhoods. And the coalition really focused in its early years on making people not see, like, the problem is the Black and Puerto Rican people are moving in. The problem is the city and the landlords and the banks are disinvesting because the Black and Puerto Rican people are moving in. And we all need to get together. And like, people would often say stuff like, you know, if the heat's off, we're all cold. And there was a real effort to kind of like think about it in a race blind way. And I think today we think more about like having a real racial analysis about it. And so, like, you know, we've come to maybe like what we would consider a more sophisticated level. But I think for the time that it was happening, it was like the thing that needs to be done to get people to not be splintered by their ethnic differences, but to recognize their common struggle in saving the neighborhoods and demanding accountability.
I just want to add that we're living in strange times.
Amen.
You know, when we talk about race, gender equity, you know, just all of these things, we're somewhat going backwards. You know, when I get to the point where I don't even want to watch the news. But I think about, you know, back in the day, and again, I mentioned I grew up in Harlem, and one of the boards also that I served on was Harlem Congregations for Community Improvement. And that was all the clergy getting together when there was the abandonment in Harlem and really stepping up and saying, yeah, we're going to renovate these buildings, but when we renovate a building and it's a 6-story building, it needs to have an elevator. And so they fought for that. You know, Reverend Preston Washington and others, they really fought to make sure it happened. And so, you know, there's stops and starts. You know, you have path marks that are developed and then they fail. You know, you have stops and starts, and we have to just stay with it and sometimes revisit the things that have happened in the past. And as you say, do it better, you know, but right now there's very scary times because, you know, we are seeing things that existed in the past. You know, right now, you know, there's what is the fair weather or whatever this is happening now, where there's been CDFIs and other funds to support, you know, Black businesses, BIPOC businesses, and there's challenges across the country now to say, no, you can't do that. And so if that happens, you know, what's the domino effect that things that we've fought for all of these years are being reversed? So for me, the message is civic engagement. If you care, don't say they're doing it, you know, be able to be, we are fighting against it.
I think we have time for a few audience questions. Folks in the room can raise your hand and there's a staff person who will come around with a mic. And I think if you're on Zoom, you can use the reaction function to raise your hand, and we have a staff person who will be able to unmute you when it's your turn. Yes, any questions?
Hello, how you doing? My name is Angus Fisher. I come from East New York, Brooklyn. A lot of what you all spoke about is currently happening in East New York and been happening. But one of the questions that I have is, how do you believe self-sufficiency models of community organizing can better support the community in some of the gaps that you all are mentioning where the city, state, and private sector does not fill in?
I was going to just overall, when I think about, you know, self-help to an extent, is when you have communities, and in East New York, you know, there's a blend, you know, of income levels and everything else coming together. And just like, you know, it's learning about investing, you know, so if you think about affordable housing, or again, you know, are there ways, again, that you can come together forming, in my mind, investment clubs, you know, things, again, where there's capital and, you know, it's also the will of the people, but also there's dollars that can come together, you know, just one idea. But I think it is important, again, in terms of just that social enterprise and the might of the people coming together and having the conversation and pushing the envelope to be able to get more done. I don't know if that's answering your question or if you know.
It touched on it, but in I guess a more defining question from that is, how can we obtain a path of self-sufficient income to plug into our system in our local community?
Anybody have thoughts on that?
So I initially asked about the organizing side, and unfortunately, funders for philanthropy kind of go through things that are like flavor of the day. And there was a time when organizing was supported, and it's much less so now. And groups that wanted to continue to do that have to find other means to be able to self-fund organizing. It's very hard. There aren't a lot of funders who fund organizing directly. It's rare that you would. There was a time when there was more support for that, but less so now. And ANHD is one of the places maybe we can convene and have people think about the contemporary times. What do we need organizing to be able to step up to do? And why do we need it so critically in these neighborhoods that are already undergoing fundamental change, so that voice can be heard? And I think a case needs to be made that there needs to be further support from the public sector and the private sector and the philanthropic community to support the organizing. At the same time, organizations are so stretched right now. I know that at AAFE, we use developer fees and other things to kind of pay for things that you don't get funded for. So we know that our services on this program side, typically you're rare that they fund themselves on self-sustaining. You have to kind of look at areas that make money to kind of plug the hole. And it's unfortunately the way things are, but it's hard to fund this kind of work. So I think there needs to be a more public conversation, again, about the need and why we need to be organizing and the role of civic engagement if you really want people to be participating in the system. Like the zoning things are very boring. You go there and you don't have enough clue what they're talking about, and you can't even insert yourself in the process. But that's why organizers are important, because then you can help kind of galvanize people, but also translate, but also speak up. But without the organizing side of it, it's hard to do that. And you can't go to the table and have people hear you if you don't see faces. And so I think a lot of it, unfortunately, is a lot of self-funding by groups right now, but there needs to be a more elevation of why this is so critical right now. I mean, you look at our communities are kind of tipped over already, and how do you even have the people who are there stay there anymore? And you need to organize and civic engagement to do that. And there aren't the resources. You're right, there aren't a ton of resources to do this kind of work.
Anyone else? Questions? Any from online?
Okay. Hi, my name is Kedar Nagrajan. I'm one of the Morgan Stanley Community Development Fellows. I think my question is a little bit more of an, since this is an open conversation on community development, sort of a state of community development type question, because each of you come with years of community organizing experience and have spoken about what it looked like some years ago. And how many of these institutions evolved directly from community organizing efforts. But a theme that ran across a lot of the things that each of you said was that to some extent, the community development landscape seems to have turned community organizing into sort of an endeavor with, in certain circumstances, a reduced political potency, where you now have several people that were part of affordable housing movements that don't seem to figure as much in organizations that are working towards the facilitation of affordable housing. For instance, affordable housing today looks very much like for-profit housing in some ways, at least in the organizations. So how then do you talk about the idea of building community power with, to some extent, an over-reliance on private investment? And this isn't me, naively suggesting that these things, that investment isn't required and the dollars aren't required to do these sorts of things. But with the models structured the way that they currently are, how do you continue to see members of your community actually influence these processes if there is such an over-reliance on, say, the executive director of enterprise to take a decision about something that's taking place in, I don't know, Crown Heights, for instance. I'm of course not from the city, but I'm, using arbitrary examples. So how then do structures of this kind need to be retweaked to some extent? Or, to what extent does the idea of some kind of state authority being brought back in to work with in a more collaborative fashion? How do you all see that, I guess, at a broader abstract level?
If we go back to our roots, and probably AAFE was probably structured this way too, we are, and I want to make sure that I'm hearing, correctly in terms of having the community engaged and, in community development corporations. We at IMPACCT, everybody who's on our board lives in the community. We are a membership organization. As a matter of fact, we're having that conversation right now with the board, because as I've gone through our articles of incorporation, our bylaws, it says, we are in essence owned by the community. And so it's a matter of really getting the community to be, actively engaged in a voice. The tools that we have in place, again, we fought for them. And as we said, some of them work, some of them don't. And unfortunately, the cost in New York City to build any kind of housing is incredibly expensive, but for IMPACT, every building that we own is one that is at a rental level that is affordable. So, and when I say that, 80% of AMI or below, in terms of the people, when we, have people move into the buildings and what have you. So they are all, and we live by our mission, vision, and values. And, just, when you say, how do you get involved? Or again, it's come and join us, be on the board, but also work for us, and it's a start. There's a lot of people that actually came through our doors as employees, and now they're, have multiplied their salaries, because you learn so much being in a community development corporation. You learn how all of this works. You learn, about taxes and investment and everything. So I say, come and work for us, with us. It might be a lower salary to begin, but in the long run, you do better.
Well, that's true. I think a lot of nonprofits right now have a hard time recruiting and retaining staff. This is not easy work anymore. It's really tough, and people are getting plucked from the private sector, even from government, into working into government. So it's hard to get people to stick with this work and do it. But it's true, the mission of an organization speaks to what it believes in and how it values the community, and it's written in there, but also how you recruit your board membership. So in addition to getting people with expertise from the community that have influence, but you also want people who are grounded in the community, who knows what it's like to live day to day and be in these housing situations and be in a situation where they can't access loans or other things for small businesses or get a decent education. So you want people like that on the board that can actually help develop the programs, but also kind of anchor the organization. But I would say, in addition to that, the civic engagement piece needs to happen in public settings, because that's where policy gets made. And so there's got to be a way to make elected officials accountable for the stuff that they pass and the policies that get approved and the programs that result from them. And so I think there used to be, I don't know if it still exists, a community planning component to a lot of these neighborhood plans. And I don't know that they really are real anymore, and whether people even understand how to insert themselves into the process. But that's what was supposed to be written into them. So there really was a community planning component. But this is again back to trying to organize people and galvanize people to understand why it's important and what difference it makes and having some impact. But I think there needs to be engagement with the public sector side of things as well, because they hold a lot of the resources and programs and incentives. And if they're not going to be accountable, then all the other funders are just going to follow that. Governments, the corporations will say, well, I got my incentive because that was given to me. But if you don't hold them accountable, the elected officials and the policy and the programs, then they're going to drift in a certain direction.
I think so. I hope we didn't give you the impression that like this is a time when organizing's not happening. I think like there's a lot of organizing happening. I think people are thinking more broadly, in the housing movement, it's often been very easy to stay very focused on like getting this building fixed and getting this landlord to be better and like solving the individual fights along the way. And I think in the last maybe decade or so, there's been a lot of focus on, dreaming up and then winning some bigger fights, the right to counsel, demanding rent, rent relief during the pandemic. And so I think people have sort of said, like, we can't be so tunnel focused on, Mrs. Perez doesn't have heat in this apartment on this day. We have to like help build the situation in which like those problems get dealt with as a regular part of life. And I don't have to organize around each one. So I think this feels like a time when people are trying to take a broader view again and think about what big things should we be organizing for. When I first heard Susanna Blankley say we should organize for right to counsel, I was like, oh, that's so cute. What a cute idea. Like, I never thought like we would win that anytime in the near future. And of course, now we have to battle to see that it's real, but like the fact that it's on the books is meaningful. We had a battle to get CRA, and then we had a battle to make it meaningful. So I think, this is a time for thinking about the next big battle. Your question about self-sufficiency, raises the economic development question that like, I think a lot of us are struggling with. And it's like, we need people to invent what are some of the things that we should do. And we should demand not only like, okay, let's get investment clubs and let's get people in the community to put in their money and their time and whatever, but let's also demand that all those, that Chase and New York City and New York State put into that plan, because that's a good idea. And like, it shouldn't just be on the people on the block to come up with the resources for it. Like, people who fund things, people who have the resources to make things happen should say, well, like that sounds like that's something that will lift up that community. I'm going to put my dollars in it.
And if I can break the rule of being the moderator for I want to highlight that I think all of like the victories you just highlighted, Margaret, and sort of all of the tools that have come out in this panel were not 1-year projects or campaigns, right? We're talking about 5-10-year organizing campaigns to win things like the right to counsel, to win things like the CRA. And if you like really go right, it's like rooted in an entire civil rights movement over the course of decades to win something like the CRA, right? What it took to get something like a low-income housing tax credit created, right? Was not a 1-year project. Folks sort of sit down and figure it out. It takes time. And I think that both for us as organizers, for folks in all parts of the movement, as well as for funders, I think that it can be scary, right? And it's a risk to focus on something that's going to have such a long time horizon. And I also believe it's important to do incremental fights along the way, but the rezoning fights, each neighborhood fight took years, and the sort of broader citywide battle is ongoing, right? So I think, I'm just struck by a lot of these examples, I think, show the need for all of us to like shift our time horizon expectations, right? If we're gonna win bigger and more meaningful change.
And I would say right now, the governor came out and said zoning was one of the tools that she wanted to use to increase production of affordable housing. Well, here's our chance to really have something systemic, but then that would really speak to inclusionary affordable housing in the zoning itself, not just each community on their own having to negotiate. But if you're going to do this, it can't just be whatever housing is fine. It's got to be meeting the needs of whoever are living there locally and what the highest need is. And I think that's where the advocacy can be on a broader scale at a statewide level if you really wanted to do that.
Yeah.
And then having more of an understanding, because when the inclusionary rules are written, understanding who, again, is it for?
Mm-hmm.
And so we have all of these buildings that have gone up, and it might be 20% of the building, 30% of the building is targeted, but then everything else is $7,000 a month.
Yeah.
And then what does that do to the services? Can you afford, your bodega now all of a sudden has become Key Food Deluxe. So it's like, so it's like everything is raised by $1 or $2 or $3. And it's like, it doesn't even, well, the ancillary services aren't affordable anymore. But understanding that, and it's like, how do you balance it? It's a question the whole country has to answer. And New York City is like, every time you read the biggest income gap, you have more people making, $500,000 and more in terms of a household, or less, the minimum number, and it's like, we constantly have this battle, but we constantly have to fight it. Be in it.
I think we have time for one more question. Or we will, a short one.
I wanted to
Yeah.
tap on what you were saying a little bit more. And yes, I wanted to tap on what you were saying a little bit more. And one thing that I did notice as I'm focused on and studying communities is that a community that doesn't necessarily have a tourist per se industry or something that drives funds to come into their community and build up is some of those communities that I see in New York City as some of the struggling ones. It's like people drive to where the entertainment is or where there's something to do. And likewise to those people that live in disenfranchised neighborhoods. And when you spend your money in those communities, it typically stays in those communities that you spend it in. You're not spending it in your own community. Your money is not being reinvested. So therefore, you're working to pay someone else. It doesn't revolve or stay within your community. And that is a greater, I guess, another discussion that can happen as far as how communities can build engagement enough to tap into the resources of tourism, or just other communities coming in to see what you have and what niche you have.
Yeah. And I think that others can chime in as well, but I think that taps into a theme that's come out throughout this conversation that, this was a conversation somewhat focused on, community development, but a little bit focused on housing. It's impossible to segment out when you actually get into how neighborhoods function and how all of our lives function. The housing justice movement and economic development and racial justice and, all schools, right? I mean, ANHD doesn't work around school issues that way, but like schools, zoning, small business, right? They all intertwine at the neighborhood level, at the personal individual level, and of course in the city. And I want to put in and so I think there's value in sort of zooming in sometimes, but then also we inevitably wind up traveling down all the other branches to how the different parts of our neighborhood economies and our city's economy intertwine.
I'm curious because you said you're in East New York, right? So are you near CCC? CCC, Christian Cultural Center?
Oh.
Okay. So, yeah, because Reverend Bernard is about to embark on a big development. And, so you have an opportunity, as a member. I don't know, I haven't sat and met with him directly yet. We had one phone call probably about 2 years ago, but, things are happening. And in terms of being engaged and understanding and speaking up with that development that's happening. And I thought of Christian Cultural Center largely because my experience in Harlem is that the churches were like, let's do bus tours. You want to see what the Black church is like? Come on up to Harlem. And it started the tours, and then after lunch at Sylvia's. What is there in East New York that's like that, to be able to, go and then stop at the Caribbean, food center or something? Well, I'm saying, again, being able to make that a destination.
So I think we're about at time. I want to do a quick plug because a lot of things that have explicitly been mentioned are going to be featured in the other 6 events that are coming up over the course of this month as part of ANHD's conference series. So Margaret, you mentioned Kingsbridge Armory. One of our events is going to be a tour of the small businesses around the Armory and then sort of ending there. So I encourage folks to check that out. Talked a lot about the banks and investment. Tomorrow we have an event focused on the impacts of banks on New York City's multi-family housing, and particularly the fallout from the collapse of Signature Bank. which was the lender in a lot of apartment buildings in New York City. We will have more events looking at other aspects of the affordable housing crisis, touching on public space and public land, touching on land use and zoning. So all of these themes that emerged are going to be featured throughout the conference series. So I encourage both folks in the room and folks on Zoom to check out the ANHD website and see what other events you'd like to attend. I really want to thank Bernell, Lydia, and Margaret for joining me in this conversation, and everyone for tuning in and showing up. And I will turn it over to Barika for closing remarks.
Yes. Let's give them a round of applause. She's telling me I have to move this way. Sorry. I'm going to slide in here. Because you all couldn't see it necessarily, but at a certain point in time, it was great. I could see it. We had like 90, 100 plus folks joining us on Zoom, right? So you all can't see that. I was like, Lourdes. And so like, I could see folks, including like Texas and other states, right? So also just think about folks, like some people are at the kind of beginning of their community development journey. And there's other places that are like, we want to learn from, I mean, it's strange things, but at ANHD, we get somebody who's like, we're Australian. Can we come talk to you? And we're like, sure. How did you find us? Right. But that happens. So Emily touched on some themes. I just want to lift up the 3 or 4 quick things that stand out to me. So interesting that in the first piece, everybody rooted it in community. And specifically, folks said community. They didn't say affordability, which I think touches on one of your questions, right? Like it started with community voice, community power, community action. It did not start with like these technical affordable housing, AMI, LI, HTC, new market tax credit definitions. It started with like community, right? That this is not, community development is not just a housing conversation, which Emily talked about. And ANHD expanded to include more explicitly economic development, but like Lydia talked about, it started with jobs at a construction site. So we can't divorce these things in our neighborhoods. And so we are intentionally trying not to divorce them in our work. I loved the stay with it and then do it better. Like, I feel like I need a bumper sticker that says that, sticker it right. It's like, this takes time. And one of the things we've talked about as a team is not being hesitant to go after the thing that takes a long arc to win, right? That's how we got to some of the things that we have now. And the last one that sort of stuck with me that Bernell said, which reminds me of something that came up at an event that I spoke up at, was like, the takeaway is figure out a way to get engaged, right? And there's different ways to do this. I always think about going back to some of my family's history of like the person who is in charge of cooking a meal as a part of an action is as important as the person at the front line of the mic. Everybody has a role. Figure out what it is, find a way to get engaged, find a way to get activated. We've got 80 plus ANHD members across New York City neighborhoods. So if you want to figure out where somebody is, you can use us as a resource to figure out who that organization is in your neighborhood. But the first step is to say, like, I'm going to figure out how to jump in. And so that's how we can all get started and organize. But we've got a lot of big challenges coming ahead, including City of Yes and this huge land use proposal. And so it's just, the work is to say, like, we're not going to shy away from the hard fights. And I deeply believe, and we in ANHD and the board and the team believe that, like, our job has been to be here for 50 years, and our job is to do the hard work to be here in the next 50 years. We don't want to shy away from these big fights. We don't want to shy away from the hard conversations. But part of our purpose is to be here for the long fight and the long work. So with that, let's give them a round of applause. Thank you, everybody. Thanks everybody online. And thank you to Chase and to Marco and Janique.